The topic is Trump's America, higher education, and the emergence of a new academic Cold War. And I've been kind of writing and doing things in this realm for some time with colleagues, including a book that came out in 2021, as David mentioned, Neo-Nationalism in Universities, with various subtitles. And so in this presentation, I'm kind of doing an update, what's going on. And there are really two components in my talk. One is to kind of give you an understanding of what really is going on in higher education and Trump's attacks on higher ed. And then I converge or move towards a discussion of what I'm calling a neo-academic Cold War, which is still kind of in formulation, but it relates to, one, America's isolation approach to science more and more, but also we're seeing other evidences of kind of a silo or axes that are changing the dynamics of science diplomacy and interactions between nation states and universities. So, see, oops, sorry, waiting for the slide to change. Oh, there we go. Do I need to hit that thing? Yeah, okay. All right. So first, I want to extend kind of an apology to all of you for all the crazy things that are going on in the U.S. It's very worrisome in various ways. Well, I just wanted to kind of note that there's this kind of discussion. Are we in the process of a slow moving coup of some sort? That's the more extreme example, but you see elements that you would see in other autocratic leaning countries, what process has gone through, and that includes, which is very evident here, unprecedented claims of executive authority by Trump and his administration, which is largely, although it's fought in the courts, some really important decisions have been made recently that empower him to, he has these emergency powers. He keeps claiming emergency powers that are really troublesome about what's his role versus the Congress and all that. So another is civil service purges. They're in a process of getting rid of, for example, scientists who work on climate change or other areas, and this kind of making sure that he has, as I say, parachecks, I can't say the word, appointment of various people to assist him in his policy realms, attacks on the courts and packing the courts in various forms, using federal powers to attack political enemies. And I don't know if you've been following the Charlie Kirk terrible assassination, but they're using this very much to attack liberal democratic states and all that, but also universities, blaming universities as somehow, the thing that led to Charlie Kirk's assassination and various innuendo. Media controls and social media, censorship aspects. So I'm not going to go into all of the aspects of it. There's the threat of the militarization of the police already in DC, but then he talks about, of course, always there are in blue states, cities in blue states that he wants to potentially deputize or federalize the police. Voting election manipulation. There's always this battle already in Texas about gerrymandering. They call it gerrymandering, but there are other aspects about trying to maybe get rid of mail-in ballots and other kinds of aspects that are important for expanding voter participation. There's this kind of acquiescence of the economic elites that, I hate to make this exact comparison, but if you know the story in the 1930s in Germany, and the economic elite just kind of followed along because they always said, oh, well, it's better than the Bolsheviks, and so we see that particularly in the tech industry, which sees an advantage to deregulation, which he's willing to do, which he also has an investment in various aspects of the tech industry, specifically currency. Orwellian messaging, a lot of reinterpretation of history. We're not supposed to have, displays about slavery. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but basically trying to attack and change the Smithsonian institution, which is our premier American history institution. And so there's this expansion of the security state as well, and we're kind of seeing how that will play out. But I'm very fearful generally. I mean, many good things about AI, but the security state, whether it's in China or whether it's in Russia or whether it's in the United States, the AI realm could really empower um, uh, um, these nation states as to how they can, monitor and follow people and then prosecute them or do other kinds of things. And then, of course, this announcement that was made prior to the to his second election, that universities are the enemy. So, you maybe have seen this statement. This was the statement made by J.D. Vance, who's the vice president, or he was the candidate at that time. If any of us want to do the things that we want to do for our country and the people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country. Universities are the enemy. And Trump has used various similar language, including that universities or colleges are dominated by Marxists, maniacs, and lunatics. And again, we're seeing a lot of this language being rebooted, which has been around. It's always being said, but with the Charlie Kirk assassination, there's really an upgrade on this as a reason to attack universities and liberal causes in general. Not that universities are always liberal causes, but so what's wrong with American universities? Um, Within the realm of thinking of the Trump administration and the MAGA movement, there are the larger aspects of a general decline in trust and value for money. Uh, um, and that the higher ed sector is not responding to labor needs and is a distrustful institution as it's part of the deep state. It focus on elites and it's too woke, brainwashing our youth. I just want you to understand that while there's a lot of attention on the elite institutions and brand names, the vast majority of students don't go to these institutions. About 42 or so percent of all the students in the United States go to community colleges. And then there's all these other elements, but the certain liberal arts colleges and then research universities, again, usually in blue states, are the subject of most of the attacks, but the language is broader than that. That, politically biased research, scientists are political operatives, in areas like such as climate change and vaccines, governance and management by liberal elites, knowing and unknowing facilitators of science and tech espionage, a popular target for Trump's political base. If you look at polling between Republicans and Democrats, a high percentage, something like 60, 65% of Republicans see universities and colleges as somehow detrimental to American society. These surveys are kind of strange. You wonder about their language and how they ask the question. But the general message is there's a big concern that they are really just, kind of little bastions that um, um, are out of touch with the reality of their MAGA world. And then the other aspect is that this is an area within the cavalcade of attacks on civil society that Trump is leading in his broad range of acolytes. That it's an area where they can showcase federal power. Trump's very media conscious. If he can attack a Harvard, a Columbia, it generates new information or distracts from the last scandal or problem. So and it's testing powers. Now, they're in various areas. This is the amazing thing, really, about this administration is the range of areas in which they're attacking elements that we would probably call basic to civil society. And universities are one and an important component of that. But this is this kind of a broad range of attacks. And here's an area in which you can test, and there's various areas that are constantly testing in the courts. Can I militarize the police? Can I impound 2.7 or billion dollars from Harvard? Can I take away 1.2 billion from UCLA? So these are uh, some of the points as what's the problem. So in the book, I'm relating a little bit to the book in the past. So we had various case studies that were done. Again, the book was published in 2021, so it's time has marched on. But we had case studies: China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Russia, Turkey, the UK, a range, Northern Europe, Germany, Netherlands. Uh, Brazil also. This was in the Bolsonaro's era. So, and then I kind of looked and tried to synthesize it. Well, what kind of range of things? How can I make sense of these various case studies? We could have had many more. We could have India or just, just no range, but you had, I think it was about 10. And then I kind of made this what I call a spectrum of neo-nationalism, in which it kind of builds on itself as you see these particulars become more specific in terms of constraining whether universities, what they can do, what faculty can do, what students can do, and what's the role of those institutions. And I would only say that, at the time when I first did it, I thought, well, the U.S. was somewhere in a nascent political movement. The MAGA movement, the first Trump administration, for example, really was a kind of a failure in many ways in terms of policy. They just weren't organized. They didn't know how things ran. Trump didn't, I think, ever thought he was going to be president anyway. It was originally kind of starting out because it would help his brand. I think that's part of the psychology, actually. But so, they were trying to cut the NSF funding, the National Science funding. I think they just weren't effective in dealing with Congress or in these areas, and they largely were rebuffed. But now we're moving, and I don't know where we are exactly. As I said, this kind of slow-moving coup, and a worst-case scenario or other things that could maybe slow it down or change it. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so where is U.S.? I'm just only kind of saying the little ball kind of tells you something about that. But so so now I had those particulars that I had outlined, and now I'm going to give you a series of particulars that are happening now in the United States. So, so far, interventionist attacks on the autonomy and on sonic of universities and colleges and science. So the first is there's this kind of using the Israeli Gaza tragedy, and I'm saying tragedy because it's a tragedy in any way you look at it. Not trying to take sides, but this is a terrible human catastrophe that's ongoing, and co-opting it because of the protests. Say at UCLA, there were protests where there was some violent clashes between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli groups. Where the blame lies is very confusing to tell you. Any analysis would tell you there were Jewish and faculty and students in the Palestinian side of the encampment. Then the pro-Zionists came and fought and through, and they were doxing each other and doing all kinds of terrible things. Basically not what we would hope would happen in the process of demonstrations. But the Trump administration just co-opted this as charges of anti-Semitism and systematic, that these institutions systematically did not respond to various threats to Jewish students and faculty. And, some of that is true. But their approach is to use this as a cudgel to go and attack universities in a broader way. So the other is also using DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion um, policies, which were ubiquitous in universities. I was talking to David before. In the 1960s, the first affirmative action programs formed. They tended to be very specific about African American students, which we have as, I think, a particularly historical, important population to assist. And it was called educational opportunity programs. And there's been this evolution over time. And I won't get into it. There are definitely many things that were done badly or poorly or undefensively at a place like Berkeley in related to DEI. But a lot of it was very, it's like assisting low-income kids from Central Valley who were Latino. And so it's all jumbled and all, but it became very ubiquitous as a term, including into grants like the NSF or the Department of Energy or Department of Education grants. So this language got worked. So they've used this using social media or other kinds, maybe AI, I don't know, to track where's that word being used in an NSF grant for physics. And we're going to now remove the funding for that because it has a set of words. And just to give you a sense of this, so here is the listing of non-mentionable words. I know it's a little, here's a highlight because And the thing is, it's done in a subtle kind of way that makes it legally kind of vague. Trump has never put out a specific list. He's just said DEI is bad. We need to end it at universities. Universities are, gone nuts with racial identity programs and politics, and so now the director of this, of the NSF or the Department of Energy, you need to go and cull and look at these grants or other things to see if that's the case. And if that is the case, they're using this language, then you can do this. So this amalgamation of words is one that the Association for the Advancement of American Association for the Advancement of Science has put together, and other groups, to say, well, how often have words been used? So, but on the science side, I just want to note to you, here's some of the highlights: abortion, autism, because it's linked to vaccines, clean energy, climate crisis, of course, COVID-19, evidence-based, female, and here's the one that's always a kicker, the Gulf of Mexico is now the Gulf of America, if you didn't know that. And watch out, Europe, you might be renamed shortly too as well. But in any case, it gives you, so they've used this language that then, so at the moment, and I'll come back to this number, in current grants given for an NSF or other scientific academic R&D, about 8.1 or $4 billion has been rescinded or impounded as these names based on largely the using this saying, you have this language in your grant. And that's a big number. So at the University of California, it's about $380 million within the system, which is a 10 campus system. So it's having a major impact. So they've also, if I kind of noted before, leveraging the DOJ and the Department of Justice and the Department of Education to launch investigations into civil rights violations related to anti-Semitism. And it's a very broad range of investigations by the administration. The 60 universities are targeted by this Department of Ed, 45 for violations of Title VI is a Civil Rights Act in the 1960s that is also an important part of educational finance and law by the DOJ. And the other thing to note is that while this is going on, again, noting the difference between red and blue states and then there are purple states, is that many of the red states are already kind of doing Trump's bidding or had been doing it before and laying out the groundwork, such as Florida or Texas, in doing various restrictions on faculty, firing faculty sometimes, saying what language they could have, and interventions in the curriculum. So here are some of the other areas of intervention. As I said before, about I think it's 8.4 or so $1 billion of grants that were cut or impounded or whatever you want to say. Sometimes they've actually said the universities owe them the money back because they had spent part of it. So it's gray and it varies by institution. Then there are university-specific impounding and demands for various forms of intervention. And you probably know about the Harvard case. And there's supposedly they first said we're going to fight this. They've had various lower court victories, but now the question is, will they strike a deal? There's rumors of striking a deal. What will that mean? And will they get all the money back? How interventionist will it be? Is it, and so these are really challenging times for these universities, these elites. So, at UCLA, as I noted, because of supposedly anti-Semitism, systematic anti-Semitism, it's about 1.2 billion. And there has been, it's not public, but a letter that went to the University, UCLA and the University of California presidents. So there's a president, and then each campus has a chancellor. It's a multi-campus system. Anytime you do one thing at one, it reflects on and impacts the rest of the system. So UCLA is not going to be making its own decision in relationship to this, but right now it's a $1.2 billion fine, and you'll get $500 million, $550 million back of funding that we took from this fiscal year if you agree to the agreement. So again, 1.2 billion, pay 1.2 billion, you get back 500 million, and all this intervention if you agree to the administration's demands. Challenging governing boards, university leaders. Again, this shows the extent of the effort that's going on. It related to higher ed, but in other fronts. So, the Trump administration and the Department of Education made it known to the University of Virginia board that they needed to fire their president because he was too woke. He wasn't being fast enough of dismantling DEI programs, and they were effective. So it's just an example of this kind of deep dive into the management of institutions. Of course, deportation and creating barriers for international students, and that's a whole another realm we could just focus on, and that's just the damaging impact of that. And we'll see how that plays out in terms of how many international students will actually enroll. We're just starting, the semester, and some institutions don't really start until late September. What the impact will be on that. Researchers are some researchers taking the offers from French universities, or I guess some UK universities. I know the ERC also has had money out to try to attract talent. It's hard to tell how that will play out in the immediate term. And here's a really important one. One of the proposals or plans is not it's another executive order. So all of these executive orders that have no absolute legal basis, but he can do this, and then somebody sues, and then the courts and all this, and it's hard to unpack that. Meanwhile, the Trump machine keeps going. So one of the things, as you're probably aware, is a fundamental aspect of scientific funding in the UK and in the US is peer review, and that the peer review process creates, you know, a somewhat apolitical process of experts looking at what areas are important for research based on a certain amount of the budget. So what he's saying now is that I want a political appointee to review every grant that is given out by the National Science Foundation or the Department of Energy or NOAA or all these other entities. So you're creating um, very much an autocratic structure, a little Orban-like structure that can regulate potentially scientific funding. So there's so many, I could go on, but that's an important one. So science is the enemy. Gone through this, I already said some of the aspects of proposed cuts in the uh, uh, I'm sorry, the current budget. Now, just to say that we have this year's budget, a lot of the findings about that, but the next shoe to drop potentially is next year's funding. And so one aspect is to change indirect costs and overhead. So in the United States, we've had indirect costs concept. In other words, the federal government gives grants out, but a certain percentage of the money that they give universities use for their buildings, for their electricity, for all the infrastructure that they have. This has been an important part of getting universities to actually, engage in scientific research because it's extremely expensive with large labs and lots of people in the labs and all that. So he's been not he, but those in the research side of the Trump administration have proposed going to 15% across the board. So just to give you an example, I know this sounds like a crazy number, but at Berkeley, for an NSF grant, the overhead is about 55%. At Stanford, because it's private and there's a reason for it, it's closer to 70%. So whether the number is correct or not, it's something that's been negotiated each over the years with these institutions. And to change that would be a huge hole financially. But the biggest hole potentially in the next fiscal year would be the proposal by the Trump administration to cut about 36% of overall R&D funding to universities. And that where's the numbers was that we have many agencies that fund. The biggest one is the National Institute for Health. So they're looking at a 40% cut if the budget goes through for NIH and a 50% cut for the NSFs. So this gives you a sense of the scale. I mean, this would be absolutely devastating. I'll come back. There's some nuances to that maybe that won't happen, but it might happen. There's a new one that just came out. It's hard to keep up with all this. I was telling David, it's like you just get, you got to be absorbed all the time because there's some new thing that comes out, and it seems somewhat planned, but it's also very, very serendipitous. Like to give you an example, the $1.2 billion demand for UCLA, apparently, it started at 500 million. Supposedly, Trump decided personally that no, it should be 1.2 because it's a nice number, right? And it gets headlines. And we're going to attack. And then one thing I didn't mention is the importance of the attack on UCLA is before it was these private institutions, obviously important, Harvard, Columbia, Penn State, not Penn State, Penn. Um, this is the first major public university that's being attacked. And when you attack a public university like UC, which is a multi-campus system, probably the most productive multi-campus system in the world, the campuses are highly ranked, they're incredibly profitable. They're also great engines of socioeconomic mobility in California, and they attract talent, which is really important for the tech industry in California, which has the fourth largest economy in the world. If it was a country, supposedly, you wonder about those numbers. You're engaging the governor, right? You're engaging the state of California in some way. The University of California has a high level of autonomy, which has been an important part of its why it is what it is, and over a 150-year, 200-year period, not quite 200. But and if you know anything about California, we have a governor named Gavin Newsom, and Gavin Newsom has been a vocal critic and leader, really, and emerging against Trump in various areas, and he's a presidential aspirant. So the dynamic is UC hasn't responded yet formally, but I'm just saying this adds a lot of complexity. So other aspects, I kind of referred to this before, appointing Trump loyalists to head science agencies, terminating mRNA vaccines, and most of the research, although not only in the U.S., but a lot in the U.S., the basic research to make the mRNA vaccine possible is university-based research. Which is usually the case in most new technologies and health, ending climate change research, the purging of federal scientists, staff, um, and just I won't get into the kind of limits on academic freedom, but this is an important aspect. People are changing how they behave. Like if you want to be a young faculty person who's a physicist and you're going to apply for a grant, you're being very careful about what the kind of things you say because this kind of big brother feeling is getting more and more significant with each month. So I won't say too much more except for, to relate it to how does the U.S., which has been this major source of scientific capacity and also interaction with the world, is changing and becoming more isolationist. And you should probably know the ending of the U.S. aid, which was a huge component of overall what we would call science diplomacy or other, also universities are very engaged in this research, whether it be water quality in South Africa or whatever, these kind of things. Obviously, threatening the end of the Fulbright program this is our signature international exchange program that dates back to the 1950s. And then placing, you got a little feedback. Then placing, I'll wait just a second, see if we can figure this out. Oh, okay. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so placing visas and other barriers on international students, auditing international collaboration agreements, and this was going on before the Trump administration, and you're seeing it in I think it's happened in the UK too, is that it is true that a lot of universities were extremely entrepreneurial and just kind of not being as careful as they might in their interactions with Chinese universities or others. And so, but it's stepping up more that they're being careful. Decoupling from the World Health Organization, UNESCO, Paris Accords, and others is this more isolationist sense of it. And then there's this kind of strange world of of foreign policy tariffs, which are affecting how universities interact with the world. And the most basic uh, example is India. This a 50% tariff. Why 50%? There's no rationale. This is very typical Trump. A 50% tariff being placed on Indian goods coming to the United States, somewhat in relationship to their accepting oil from and purchasing oil from Russia. But this is having a downward depressing market demand for Indian students, which, Chinese, Indian, the biggest, largest grouping of international students to come to the United States. So there's this quasi strange world in which these other aspects of foreign policy will affect universities. Uh-oh, where's the thing go? Oh, there it is. Sorry, I got it. Okay. Fighting back. Well, I'll only say a couple of things about that, and because looking at time. Um, so how can universities fight back? There's so many fronts that in which are, you know, are being fought back in civil society generally, whether it's migration, immigration, or tariffs, or military and the police. There's just such a range of things. It's like it is a fire hose of various aspects that are damaging civil society, open societies, and so it's hard to unbuckle that, unpack that, I should say. And so, it's hard to get attention to the public. Maybe in a blue state you get more sympathy, but to how to battle these actions by the Trump administration when you have a House and a Senate that are just marginally, but importantly, majority of Republicans, and Trump owns the Republican Party. There are a few at the edge who want to moderate, but it's very politically challenging for them. And thus far, they've made noise of protest, but in the end, they have basically gone along with, for example, the big beautiful bill, if you know that piece of legislation. So, but there are efforts that are important that tend to be either really focused on individual legislators, which is the traditional way, but also lawsuits. And there's about 120 lawsuits that are now, there are probably more, it's hard to keep track of them. Uh, and they're often done in cooperation with a series of universities and what is called the American Association of Universities, which is this about 65 top public and private universities. Berkeley's one of the founding members, a little bit like the Russell Group. Um, of the American Association for Colleges and Universities, the American Association of University Presidents, and also the American Civil Liberties Union. And there are more. So they've joined together to try to, block uh, for example, and they did successfully, but it's maybe temporary, Trump's demand that international students couldn't go to Harvard. So that was gone into a lawsuit, and it's at the lower courts, and then it'll be appealed, and then it goes up. And so there are always some vagary as to whether it's a victory or not. In the meantime, chaos is caused and problems are caused. On the international students, they have been um, allowed to go back to Harvard, but it's unclear whether it'll keep going. As I said before, much of a target on blue states. So you have a support structure around blue states, and the red states tends to be like the University of Alabama, that they're already kind of conforming in various ways with the Trump administration's demands. The evolving nature of making a deal, and that is, so Harvard now says it may make a deal. Columbia did for $200 million, which seems a lot different than I think the current number is. Well, they're withholding 2.7, but I think a deal might be more like $1 billion for Harvard. Don't ask me why. These numbers don't add up. But basically, these institutions are trying to navigate. Should I make a deal? Should I not make a deal? Can I mitigate some of the costs? Because like a Harvard has huge endowments, but endowment money isn't just green, it's for specific things and it has various constraints, and it's not a sustainable plan. And this is all around what's happening now in the fiscal year, as I said before. So I think, for example, the University of California is still kind of, I think they're elongating. It's been very quiet. I don't know what's going on exactly, elongating whether to make a deal or not. And I was also telling David is that the thing is, you make a deal about this year's fiscal budget, and you get certain interventions, including a monitor to look over your admissions, that your admissions data gets overlooked by the Department of Ed or the Civil Rights Office or various other interventions. Like, for example, they've also demanded and got the firing of the head of Middle East Studies program. I believe that was at Harvard. And so what level of intervention? But then you've got the next shoe to drop, which is this fiscal year budget. And so it's kind of like, can you trust them? Are you making a deal with the devil and they'll just keep coming back and have ways to hurt you, even if it's illegal or you think it's illegal? And as I noted, when you do get into these fights, it can be very lengthy because they tend to go, like, many of them will go up, and one did go to the Supreme Court, and it wasn't good. The result is just recently there was an $800 million or so money in the NIH, and I'm not sure where it was going, but it was about $800 million. And there was a case brought to the Supreme Court, and it said that he doesn't have the power to just impound this money. These are contractual agreements with universities. It was a class action suit, so a grouping of institutes. And the Supreme Court said, well, we think 5-4, no real explanation as to the decision, but they basically said, well, he does have the power to do that, but we think there could be some cases in which he shouldn't have the right to do that. So each of the individual claimants go to a lower court and file your own individual claim. So this is reaffirming the executive power uh, to limit funding or impound funding or these kinds of things. So as I said before, there is some hope of science funding uh, in Congress, and there's a fighting about that. And we'll see if the appropriations process could change that. So shaping public opinion, that's a very difficult task. Uh, Hope in the midterm elections, I think that's part of one possible change. If the House is flipped to Democrats, that could add some teeth. So one question is the infrastructure and culture and norms of America's university and science community able to withstand this Trump era? Is it a period in which they can recover? So looking at time and looking at David, uh, I'm not going to give my little presentation. I'm sorry I went along, but we were delayed a little bit.
No, carry on. If
Oh,
you need a glass slide.
Well, I just have a few more. I just want to say about this emerging Cold War, and I think I could do it rather quickly. So I'm trying to work on this, and I've written a chapter that's coming out, but it's still kind of early in trying to figure out. With America's isolationism, there's a series of events going on that are creating kind of a neo-academic Cold War. It's not like the original Cold War. It's not a bipolar fight between Russia and China. I'm sorry, and Russia and the U.S. that was really driven by military technology and superiority, not economic competition, but it was geopolitical. But now this new one is a multipolar kind of world that's evolving. And it's not just the US. So the US is a big player, absolutely, in the world science, open science conceptual idea, which we had an optimism about globalization that there was opportunities for consensus, open science. We're sharing data. We're doing collaborative research. Chinese faculty with American faculty with UK faculty, and all of that. But that's now beginning to change. And I say there's a series of traumas, and I won't go through all of them, that have led to this. It's not just Trump. It's you can go back to September 11th and the World Trade Center, which led to the American Patriot Act, and other countries also had more, guidelines around terrorist nations and immigration controls, global recession, Brexit, obviously, and its disassociation and maybe now association with the Horizon program. So it gets messy. obviously the proliferation and growth of neo-nationalism in illiberal democracies, declining public trust. I said that before. The war in Russia, Russia war on Ukraine, the tragedy of the Israeli-Gaza war, isolating Israel in various forms, but also dividing people up as to how they should interact with faculty or universities there, Trump's return, and then the hardening of these alliances. And I, I just this show of kind of revival of autocratic fascism with this military parade in, in Beijing. I mean, the images are not one that brings comfort to those who want to see a world that is more cooperative. So, and there are a lot of reasons for it and there are motivations, but when you're associating with the ruler of North Korea, you know there's something going on that is not good. So, indicators. So there are politicalization of funding research. Here's the criteria. Like what are some of the things that we could look at to tell us whether there's a new academic Cold War? Politicization of funding research, limits on data exchange, that's already happening. Shifting silos. Oh, I got two S's there. I was looking for that. International co-authorship of papers. It's not that there aren't still growing numbers of co-authorship, but it's shifting and where it's happening. For example, U.S. co-authorship with Chinese authors is going way down. And you're seeing part of the images that I'm talking about, how this reshifting around of the Cold War, either I call it accesses or silos. I'm having a hard time figuring out what's the right word. Anti-immigration policy, shifting talent mobility. So we'll see how that plays out. So, what does it look like? I don't know exactly. I'm trying to figure it out. It's kind of hard to do, but you see a kind of a European, Asia, global South axis growing. I mean, I think from an American's viewpoint, we're looking to Europe. I hope I can't count. I guess the UK is not Europe, but almost kind of. Is it? No, it is. Yes. Okay. So but seeing that kind of as an important balance to the isolationist impulses of America, but you're going to have your own troubles with that. The China axis with Russia, but it's also more complex because it has, I'm almost there. It has uh, the Belt and Road policies. So I kind of said, okay, graphically, this doesn't quite work, and I'm almost at the end here, is that here's the kind of the world. They're not separated. I don't, the silos isn't quite right. I like the word axis because it's a 1930s world of fascism and it tells you kind of a storyline that relates to that. And Russia's off there, and that bubble's too big because Russia is not a big. It doesn't compare to the UK as a scientific power, but I can only fit certain things there. So don't take the bubbles too literally. But then you have this kind of other axis, and the other aspect is this you used to say non-aligned, but there really are multi-aligned countries: India, Brazil, Turkey, parts of South Africa, or not South Africa itself, but Africa adds another kind of complexity that the Russians have their foothold some places, the Chinese too, the French and other parts of Africa. That's David's area. But so this is kind of graphically where I'm thinking, and I'd like any input from that. So finally, winners. Who are the winners? Europe, I hope. Uh, China, I think that's evident with its growth and continued investment and efforts to bring back talent to China. But there's some exaggeration there. Like citation analysis is becoming very noisy, and you got to watch some of that. But it's a big power, obviously. Some multi-lane countries, U.S., Russia, obviously. But the bigger part is open science, science diplomacy, world health. These are all going to suffer if we're not collaborating more fully. So finally, how will it evolve or devolve? Well, we could guess, but I'm just saying on the UK, European side, what if Reform UK comes into power? Will they be modeling a lot what's happening in the US? I would imagine here in the UK. I can't say that for sure. Would Scotland finally depart? I don't know. Germany and the AfD, if they come into power, what about National Rally in France? And then the Netherlands and Sweden. Netherlands is kind of rocking back and forth, but the Swedish are very conservative. So, and the European side could dissolve and not be what I'm hoping is a counterbalance. So thank you for your patience, David. And that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, you've given us an amazing amount to think about, and I'm going to stop sharing here so that we can see you and we can see everyone online. And I'm going to ask our online commentators to come in first. I think, Susan, you were first in line. You've given us so much to think about, and we'd like to talk all day. We really only have about 8 minutes. Well, let's extend a little bit beyond. And
I'm looking at Susan.
Okay, it's fine. You should be able to see her now.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So, Susan, it's all yours.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Because all I can see is a red screen.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay,
We can
so
hear you though.
Yes, all we've got is a red screen, but that doesn't matter. My question remains the same. It's perhaps a reflection and a kind of question that follows. One reflection is that you start off by saying it's a slow coup, and I think it's anything but a slow coup. I think it's a rapid coup, and it's all over the place, and it's got all the markings of a kind of guerrilla warfare. You're not playing by the rules of the game at all. That's the first thing. But my more serious point is around you don't make that distinction. You dive in and you call it a Cold War. And I think my reflection here is that there's two things going on. One is that there's a civil war and there's a Cold War. And the Civil War is about endogenous dynamics that are kind of taking place around the internal workings out of the period, the 1970s and 80s onwards, actually, even maybe the 70s, if we want to put in the attack on civil liberties, freedom of speech, diversity, all that kind of stuff. I think that's all part of it. And then I think there is a separate dynamic, and that's the Cold War dynamic. And these are, the kind of head-to-head to some extent with China around broadly I'd call AI nationalisms. And so we've got these endogenous and exogenous dynamics, and they are deeply contradictory. And I think that's a better kind of explanation. And then I think the bit I've been doing, which I think is really helpful, is to run a comparison between that first Cold War and the second Cold War, and they're so unbelievably different. What gets set up in the first Cold War is that huge amount of funding for the National Science Foundation gets established, etc., etc., and now they're all being dismantled, which is kind of extraordinary. So that's really just my reflections that I think are potentially kind of worth thinking about. Maybe one final thing. To some extent, because a lot of the research and development is also coming out of Silicon Valley and their own kind of R&D kind of infrastructures within their university, within their Silicon Valley universities, and I mean the big Google companies and so on. If you look at AI outputs and things like that, they're not coming out of the universities. In a way, they don't care. So to some extent, the AI endeavor is already stitched up privately, internally in the United States, by way of contrast with China, which is actually largely through the China funded universities. Well, they're not private, they're not mainly private. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks, Susan. I think that, all those points are, I know you're working on this area with colleagues. So I think all the points are good. And I do think it's just as popular right now to say a slow coup. Because I think it's a hopeful way of putting it. But the pieces just keep falling in place, and there's just the kind of a testing each time about how far can the president go, and with various executive orders and the like. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Great question, Susan, and yes, a lot of this is unfolding in front of us, isn't it? Let's go on, and I think the next person to ask was Ellen. Ellen, do you want to come in?
Thanks for a great talk there, and you certainly went through everything that we see on our screen and on our news feed by the day. What I'm trying to work out is, as my question says, I mean, arguably, university-based research is a key driver for economic activity. Okay, we overplay it. It isn't all funded, but we get the gist. Looking at the data, regardless of your point, and I take your point about citation data and so on, but OECD Science and Technology has been tracking China on frontier research for quite a while. And we see all that. And the pharma sector, I get it, or the US wants to repatriate this. I mean, it's a bit ridiculous that you don't have any manufacturing of generics, even in the US. I mean, it's a bit of a problem, get that. But I'm really trying to work out, how does all this fit together with the Make America Great thesis? Where's the economics behind it? Why would you destroy NIH and NSF for your scientific data? Why would you do that? I mean, if you're trying to build up that. I mean, okay, Susan's point about the idea that the AI is basically all set up. Well, you know, that's one part of it. What, are you returning to coal? I mean, is this the answer for the future, back to the 19th century? So tell us how this all fits together, or does it not? Where's the economics strategy behind all this, aside from the idea that tariffs is going to be the factor that repatriates everything? Thanks.
Well, it doesn't fit together. It's incoherent. It's more impulsive, and it relates to kind of just a series of complaints and visions, largely held by Donald Trump. I think that's probably the answer. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, does it, to disinvest? So potentially, we don't know quite yet what the outline will be in the budget going next year, but it's very worrisome in terms of R&D investment by the federal government. But you know, obviously, if you want to build up your capacity for new technologies and growth in your economy, you would be investing more. And you know, that's this funny, one of the ironies is that, you know, this is the Reagan administration. One of the things they did was, yes, they cut federal funding significantly, but the other thing he did, because they were so worried about the final change in the trade surplus, was to invest in science. And why? Because we were competing with Japan, and they saw that basically this was the path to do something about that. It also was backed up by research, as I was telling David, that was done at the NSF about the link between basic research and economic development in the 1970s, so which kind of laid the basis of this larger argument that is exaggerated sometimes. But back to it's hard to make things line up. It seems heavily impulsive, but then again, it's part of this gradual plan just to dismantle the deep state, the federal government, and overall. And I would say too, just to kind of a little sympathy, not sympathy, but trying to understand the rationale of some people that support Trump and the Reagan administration. Yes, a lot of them are MAGA, but some of them are just old school Republicans. They don't like government. They want to see it dismantled. They want to defund it. And, you know, so, but back to the rational, if you're saying, look at tariffs, how do we, you know, how do we figure out the scheme of tariffs as a logical process to get to an end result of advantaging the United States economy in a global world. So it's unfortunately more impulsive than it is rational.
But it's funny because there's a lot of tactics and strategy in a lot of what's going on.
It is.
So you have this funny combination of deeply thought through Heritage Foundation vision and then the impulsiveness of.
Yeah, I mean, there's just kind of irrationality going all around. Here's another example. Okay, the University of Alabama is the biggest employer in the state of Alabama. It has a gigantic medical facility that handles, and a lot of it's for low-income people because they get money through, we didn't even talk about those other aspects of Medicare and Medi-Cal and the things, Medicaid, I'm sorry, that could change the dynamics of university hospitals and all these kinds of things. So it's a major employer. They've got two senators who aren't saying anything about these cuts to their institutions. They're falling in line. You know, they're anti-government. They want it to shrink. Whatever Mr. Trump wants, they'll do. So it's really hard to add up any kind of coherent understanding. I mean, there is a basis there, dismantle the state.
Okay. Okay.
I get that, but the economy is almost not quite in free fall, but depending on the data you look at, it'll be interesting. Anyways,
I
thank you
understand.
very much.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is, again, I didn't get to this, but the hope for the midterms or some change isn't going to be the universities going out and convincing people that it's bad to cut the university. It's going to be people don't get their welfare checks, that they aren't getting their medical care by the federal government, that there has to be some financial and personal impact on people in purple and red states to make a change in the government.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. That's a great question, and exactly what I was pushing over lunch, but I'd love to see you. We probably have time for one more question. If we could really be here all day, but I want to leave time for those of you in the room. So if you'd hang on for one last question online, I'll say goodbye to everyone online, and then we can carry on here. So Anne, you asked a great question about the consequences of the Charlie Kirk killing. Do you want to ask that question? You may need to unmute yourself. And Corbett, are you around still?
Anne.
So you might have gone, in which case,
all these great colleagues. But
yes,
I
in
could
which
say
case,
something about that.
yes. So the question is simply, I'll read it out. Given the consequences of Charlie Kirk's effort to set up chapels in almost 90 universities, institutionalizing his movement, how are other groups of students likely to react?
How are other students likely to react?
Yeah. So what are the consequences of this? I guess, yeah.
Well, I don't pretend I know completely. I didn't realize that he had such a pervasive showing, but I would imagine it's in certain institutions. Right. So again, there's probably a heavy alignment with red versus blue states. So maybe it reflects the already existing political culture in those particular. It's not happening in California. Let's put it that way. I'm not aware. Probably there isn't one in a California university that we might have a few that have conservative viewpoints. But I will say again, the frightening aspect of these something like this is how they're leveraging his death to showboat and just really use it as a way to attack many other people that are, even if you're a terrible thing, you don't want anyone to be assassinated. We don't need political violence. We don't want it. It's terrible. But they're just gearing up. So I understand Trump is going to come from the UK and he's going to go to Charlie Kirk's funeral. They're taking over his podcast. J.D. Vance has actually hosted the last podcast. And here's a quote from one of the conservative presses that reflect how they're reacting to this. They're really blaming universities, even though we don't know if this guy, he went to Utah State for a couple of years or something, and like how that fake relates to converting him into a leftist radical a violent radical who knows how to fire a sniper gun. I don't know. But here's from the Free Press, which is a right-wing paper. In the same way that madrasas radicalized jihadists, America's campuses are among the places in the U.S. most hostile to disagreement and debate. So there's this kind of feeding into the general rhetoric, and it's not good. It's damaging. How do you overcome that kind of level of social media, press, interpretation? We're going to blame the universities and colleges for this assassination anyway. It's very worrisome.
Absolutely. There are more questions online. I feel like I should give the people in the room a chance to ask the questions. I know that as it's past 3 o'clock, so feel free to head off and do your other things. But if you would like to listen in, we'll take a couple of questions from the room. I think, Adam, you were first and then Lisa. Is that okay?
As you were talking, I wonder if we're missing part of the puzzle, which is if we looked at some of those other states, Turkey, India, the first thing that comes along with the neo-nationalism and its role in universities is also religion. And I wonder if some of the way we make sense of what seem like impulsive, dismantling, ununderstandable kind of movements isn't actually just towards a kind of religious fundamentalism, a real kind of conservative orthodoxy. And I think that becomes something like especially to bear in mind, because if you think about, say, Turkey and India, what they do first is they dismantle, they cut everything, and then they try to, rebuild, whether it's history or the social sciences or other sciences, in line with their kind of religious contours. And so I wonder, to what extent do we, because it's America, because it, seems this place where religion doesn't have that same aesthetic, basic kind of almost Orientalist role in how we might analyze it somewhere else. To what extent does that actually explain one of those drivers that propels some of these changes? The battles they choose, right? The anti-Semitism connotation is kind of a big part of their, religious fundamentalism from the side of Christianity as well. And similarly with kind of the DAI and the battles they choose there.
It's a very good point. And absolutely, in Turkey and in Hungary, religion is an important component of it. We could even say in a place like China that it's the religion of the PRC, but it's basically a very similar dynamic. So on the U.S. side, I think it's just a little more complex, is that it is an important component in the MAGA movement and Trump's popularity, but it's not the only component. It doesn't shape. I mean, there's certain issues like don't teach children about transgender people or yeah, so in these kinds of things, there are definite elements there. But I think, as I was saying before, it's a broader movement than that. It makes it more powerful. So there, I think, a lot of people who are Trump supporters who believe almost all the lines about universities being indoctrination camps. And I didn't get into it, but we have blame in relationships to many of these issues. There are a lot of badly done things in universities, and but as I said, it's exaggerated. And the other principle that's been so important is that universities have a certain level of autonomy in their function. This is what has really made them great. They could be held accountable. There'd be other ways to do that, not with a bludgeon, not with this kind of, as I said, the punishment far outweighs the crime. If there is a crime, there is a crime. There's a problem. So, but back to the thing, I still think there's a large component of people that a lot of Americans don't go to church, but they say they're religiously oriented. I mean, so are we talking about evangelical movement, which has been very powerful, particularly in the 70s? It's still there, but it's not the power it was. It's there, and it's helping outline some parts of it. But I still think there's a substantial portions which may be persuadable who are independents, and which is the largest grouping of people, more than Democrats or Republicans now. And a lot of them are just like, I don't like government. I don't want to pay my taxes, or I don't want to pay that level. Or there's government regulation, and it could be at the local level, and it's very frustrating. And there is, I think we all agree, there's too much regulation. There are problems with regulation, then are good things. So I still think it's a more diverse um, grouping of people that are supporting this movement
Okay.
and shaping it.
Yeah, and evolving as well. Lisa.
To see that the processes that are happening now aren't going to have a profound effect on universities. I think, it's clear that they are. With the disciplining and the taming of universities, so that universities are now handing over lists of names, which is just
as Berkeley did that.
A shocking development. How do you think, what impact do you think this is going to have on the university as an institution in the next 5 years? And is there any coming back from that?
Well, I kind of asked that question at the end of my, or part of my thing is, and it's a good question. I think, unfortunately, I think it's going to be profound impact. And partly just, we could talk about different aspects of universities. One is, how do they run budgetarily? And the ecosystem for these research universities could take an incredible hit, which, it's just devastating. the kind of numbers we're talking about are just unfathomable. And this relates to the infrastructure. The budget relates to whether you have graduate students and are they in labs and can you attract talent and the top talent, right? I mean, that's the one thing. And we're a global player. We should be attracting talent from throughout the world. And the other part is you integrate them or have them an opportunity to become citizens. It's absolutely vital if you're going to attract that top talent. All those pieces are falling apart. So unfortunately, it does look really bad. Now, here's another scenario that's a more hopeful scenario, is that the level of, the Trump administration gets a couple of deals. It's symbolic. I'm doing this to the universities. And also, as I don't think I had it in here, but there was something called uh, anticipatory obedience. A lot of activity is going to try to mitigate potentially coming down. And let's say 10% or 20% of that is actually maybe good. It's like, I don't know, like these are complex places. They have their problems, they have their strengths. So, but and then there's other issues that come up. China invades Taiwan. It's like I don't want that, of course, but other kinds of things that maybe the level of effort declines and it kind of evens out. And if there's actual fighting and they win in the more traditional sense, appropriations that the cuts are anything like this in the science side, then we're really talking about some of the programmatic aspects of the institution, like should you have race-based scholarships? And I say yes, but we could have a good argument about that aspect. Certain kinds of operational aspects of the institutions will shift and change. But let's say that happens, and then or the ferocity of the attacks are redirected somewhere else or decline. They get their wins, and that shapes the industry in some form. The budget isn't as bad as it's supposed to be. Midterms, the Democrats get the House. It could be repairable, but it might not.
There's a couple more questions online. There's one more in the room, please. Yeah.
The is related to the anti-intellectualism rooted in the American society. And another question is, like, if next term a Democratic Party become the administration, do you think these things will change?
What was the first question?
Anti-intellectualism.
Oh, yes, right. Yeah, this is a theme in American history that particularly was articulated in the 1950s in the middle of McCarthyism. And so there is a strong anti-intellectual part of history, which relates again a little bit to the deep state theme, to governments too big, we're being run by elites, even though we have a new set of elites. What elite? Yeah, Donald Trump. So, which is always still a kind of a crazy thing, is that he gets votes from the lower middle class laborers and things like that, or people that his policies are terrible for them, but they still like him because he's a personality. It's all of that kind of stuff. So that theme is definitely a component of all of this discussion, the anti-intellectual side of it. And the other was, if we have a new administration comes in, I think getting back to the question that was asked before, there's going to be permanent damage to the capacity of these institutions to perform. Maybe not so much in how many students they bring in, but their research capacity, their intellectual, not viability, but vitality. And I don't think if the worst case scenario happens, it's a long-term damage. You just don't rebuild it in a quick amount of time. So, but I thought actually where you're going, one question is, will say a Democrat say Gavin Newsom becomes president of the United States. We're assuming that Trump doesn't try to have a third term, and there's all that kind of speculation and worry and interesting legal moves around that and definitions. And there's a lot of jockeying going on by conservative lawyers. But let's say Gavin Newsom comes in, and one question is, would he be as abusive only on the other side as Trump? And I would say I'm kind of a liberal, so center left liberal, I'd say. I don't think so. I don't think we would do it. We're too moral. That's my sense. But in any case, no.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask one question that links partly to the great question posted in the chat by Chiang Zhao, asking about China and the US's relationship to China, because I did see something that Trump made an aside a couple of weeks ago saying, "Oh, we like Chinese students. Did you hear this?"
Yes.
And it was a very odd, given everything you've been saying. And Jiang's question is, why wouldn't the US want to seize talent from its major competitor? So what's going on there with that comment, do you think?
Impulsive.
Okay.
Non-logical.
Okay.
Maybe he had some moment where he spoke to some people say, and I don't think it's completely true.
The last
the last person reading that he heard, and so he said a number that's ridiculous, 200,000 more or something, right? I think we're already at 300,000 or something. I'm losing track, but maybe it was 200. We're like doubling, which doesn't make any sense anyway. But so he just impulsive at the same time.
But would someone act on that? Would someone then go away and think, "Oh my gosh, he now wants this"?
I think it's just verbiage at the moment. I could be pleasantly surprised, but all the elements, including Trump is the leader of the party, but there's so many pieces of anti-Chinese legislation by the Republican Party about there was a bill to say no Chinese students should come to the United States, and it didn't go anywhere, but it reflected a significant portion of a Republican Party thought. And then there's this question of academic espionage, and it does exist, and there are problems related to it, but it's probably exaggerated, and there are a lot of controls now for that. As to what students can go into what field. So there are issues around academic espionage, but the Republican Party generally has been taking this, very extreme view, and a very, sledgehammer approach to all of these kinds of issues. So I wouldn't see that would align well. So I think it's just rhetoric.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. You've been brilliant, and you've given us so much today, and lots to think about. Lots, really, this is quite bleak, despite the irrationality.
Sorry.
There's also there are more questions online, but we probably should wrap up. We've gone over our slot. We're all worried. I mean, you must be existentially worried about what's happening, but I think it's important that we talk about these and find out from people like you who've been watching this for a while. And as you say, we shouldn't hang off every legal case, because it's actually being able to see the longer term, what's going to happen in the long term. So we need to look out for the midterms, I guess, because that seems to me to be a pivotal moment for the way the political campus is turning. Mm-hmm. So a final round of applause, really, for online and here in the room. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for coming.
And just a reminder, everyone online, that we will post the slides and the chats and the video tomorrow. And we're returning to this in future webinars. So do look at our list, because this is not something that's going to go away quickly. Thanks all for coming, and see you next Tuesday, everyone.